Hi, Eric here. This video is going to be focused around new gardeners, like myself. I'll be sharing both my successes and failures, as failures can be equally, if not more important, to learn from. This is the first year that I've truly tried my hand at gardening, and I have completely tumbled down the internet rabbit hole in the process. So in turn, everything you see in my current backyard is an experiment. I really want to test how much I can get away with. It's May 21st, 9 a.m., and today we're going to look at tomatoes. The only time before this that I actually tried to grow tomatoes, I only produced 3 tomatoes off of one plant. 2 of those 3 tomatoes got eaten by tomato worms, and the last tomato got end blossom rot. After that, I took a year off of gardening after feeling completely defeated. And I gained an entirely new respect for successful gardeners. Many experienced gardeners give the advice that new gardeners should grow tomatoes, claiming that tomatoes are the best plant to start with. Now, they're not wrong, but you, the new gardener, are misunderstanding. At least I did. They're not recommending tomatoes because they're easy. They're recommending tomatoes because they're finicky plants that will teach you a lot about growing crops. If you master how to produce an abundant amount of tomatoes, then you might be able to grow just about anything else that you want in your garden. I'm going to show you my first-hand experience with growing tomatoes successfully this season, and what I'm going to do to prevent issues like pests and end blossom rot. My little setup here, which I MacGyvered in the most janky way possible, is still able to produce a significant amount of fruit. Before I get into how I've done this, I want to start from the ground up and detangle everything I know about tomatoes thus far as simply as I can. So let's get into it. First, we need to talk about the varieties of tomatoes. Tomatoes will fall under 2 categories: determinate or indeterminate. Determinate tomatoes are generally referred to as bush tomatoes. The shape of these plants will remain bushy and more compact, but some varieties can still reach around 12 feet. As the name states, these tomato plants have a determinate or set size that they'll reach. They also have a set amount of flower clusters. This produces some specific challenges that can stress out a gardener quite a bit. If you happen to lose some flowers, or even some tomatoes, it's like watching your tomato plants lose value in real time. Fear not though, with less tomatoes, your remaining fruit will not only become larger, but they will most likely taste better as well. Indeterminate tomatoes are vine tomatoes. Just like the name, they grow in a vine pattern. Expect these plants to get anywhere between 8 feet and 30 feet. Yes, 30. Both the height and the amount of fruit from these varieties will completely depend on the sunlight, temperature, and available nutrients that you give them. Hybrid varieties can intermingle between determinate and indeterminate plants. So, it's important to look them up to see which side of the fence they predominantly land. Otherwise, quite literally, they may crawl right over your fence, and your neighbors will either have choice words for you or choice tomatoes on their plates. Whether you've picked out exactly what tomatoes you want to grow, or just impulsively bought some tomato starts from a big box store, we need to talk about what you're putting your tomatoes in and what soil to use. First off, all of my tomatoes are in pots ranging between 2 to 3 gallons, and I would not recommend this. For me, they're incredibly hard to water properly. The plants are so top-heavy that they've fallen off this stand several times when a breeze hits, and the day-to-day heat where I live can swing from 105 degrees to 85 the next day. If you're going to grow tomatoes in pots, I recommend at least 5 gallons, either putting them in the ground or putting them in a raised garden bed, which I believe to be the best option. The mix that I've planted my tomatoes with is a soil topper with roughly 50% bark. The reason behind this is to prevent my tomatoes' roots from suffocating, causing end blossom rot. The other half of this mix is organic food scrap compost, which is super important, and I'll explain why later in this video. These are the only soils that I'm using for my tomatoes this year. When planting your tomatoes, there is a technique, especially when planting in pots. To set up your tomatoes for success, you need long-lasting nutrients and readily available nutrients. No, these are not the same thing, and skipping either of these steps will lead to stunted growth. First, when potting up tomato starters, make a hole in your pot and give it half to even a full handful of granulated fertilizer. A general use fertilizer is fine, like this 444. But there are better fertilizers specific to tomatoes, such as 565, 274, or other fertilizers with higher phosphorus. Notice how I did not mix the fertilizer or spread it around. I placed it directly under the roots of these tomato clones. For pots, mixing your granulated fertilizer is not only a waste of time, it actually hinders the point of putting it in there in the first place. If you want explosive growth early, this is how you do it. To quickly simplify the NPK, or the numbers you see on these fertilizers, the first number you see is nitrogen, which is basically for green growth. The second number is phosphorus, which is for flower buds and roots. And the third number is potassium, which is for plant metabolism. You can use a granulated fertilizer super high in phosphorus right at the start for your tomatoes, even though we don't want flowers on our young plants. This is because it takes a while for granulated fertilizer to break down in your soil. It's not instant, and it is not readily available nutrients. Note that if your soil isn't made up of compost or other microorganism-rich substrate, your granulated fertilizer will not be broken down. If your soil doesn't do the work for you and break down your fertilizer, the fertilizer will either do nothing and you've wasted your money, or it will burn your plant roots and your plants won't survive. This is why I use compost in all of my outdoor gardening mixes. Otherwise, I can't use fertilizer like this. The other game-changing advice that I can give is using liquid-soluble fertilizers. Don't use this right away though. This stuff is super powerful. I recommend waiting either 1 week from the day that you've planted your tomatoes or until they've doubled in size. Because liquid-soluble fertilizer is readily available nutrients, you can easily burn the roots of your plants if they're not ready to receive that amount of nutrients. You can use organic or synthesized water-soluble fertilizers. Use whatever you're comfortable with. Follow the directions on the back, as these can range between 1 teaspoon to 2 tablespoons per gallon. Now that we've talked about how to feed your tomatoes, we should probably talk about how not to accidentally murder them. When tomato plants are young, especially if they're indeterminate varieties like cherries and so on, they might not be able to handle full sun conditions right at the start of the growing season. Instead of the 6 to 12 hours that most bush tomatoes can handle, indeterminates will do better in half sun conditions like 3 to 4 hours of direct sunlight at the start of the season. Don't worry though, depending on the variety, this setback is very temporary at only about 1 to 2 weeks. Once your indeterminates have doubled or tripled in size to at least 16 inches in height, they should easily be able to handle full sun conditions. Determinate tomatoes might have this issue, but I found this not to be the case personally. Watering, the grand mystery of tomatoes. What's too much water? What's too little water? Why are my tomato plants wilting and dying? This is such a confusing question, and the internet is very bad at helping you with it. There are 2 ways that you can unalive your plants with watering. The first way is to overwater, but what does that really mean? It means that you're suffocating your plant. No, not drowning, suffocating. Using dirts and soils that aren't aerated, that have, say, a lot of clay, or maybe you're even using that #1 money scam in gardening called potting mix. These things have a commonality. They either retain way too much water, or they trap too much water. And those pockets of water, which would normally be filled with oxygen, are now little swamps underneath the soil line. That's like living your day-to-day life with fluid in your lungs, and each time you take a breath, someone pours more water down your throat. There's a huge reason why my soil mixes are 50% aerated, barky, and woody material. It's because I wanted to completely remove the idea that I could be suffocating my plants. So, if an issue arises with these tomatoes, I'll be able to find out what's happening a little bit easier. The second way to incorrectly water is to underwater your plants. Especially for baby plants, you need to physically touch your soil. Does it feel dry? Scratch the surface of your soil. You can take up to an inch away, and that will be very telling of your current circumstance. If it's still wet, I would wait to water, but check later the same day to make sure it's not too dry. If it's bone dry, your plants are in some trouble. Young plants can't handle overly dry conditions, especially if you have fertilizers in the soil. Those fertilizers will burn your roots. It's essentially like sitting in a tub of vinegar. It might make your skin feel nice for a while, but after a period of time, your skin will start to dissolve. Yeah, maybe I should rethink my similes. That one was kind of gross. The roots of young plants might take 1 to 3 days to fully soak up water in pots if you're watering in the morning, so be patient. Once they start taking off, especially in my case being in 2 to 3 gallon pots with almost adult plants, you might have to water twice a day. Here's another polarizing subject on the internet. How do you prune your tomatoes? Well, what I can tell you from personal experience is that in a home garden, you definitely should be pruning your tomatoes, but probably not to the severity that you've seen online, because a lot of those tips have been passed down through commercial growers that need specific sizes and colors for their fruits. Every tomato variety is different and therefore should be given slightly different attention, but there is a simple, common practice that everyone should probably do. This rule excludes cherry tomatoes, but generally, you should remove the first few flower clusters, or suckers, from your tomato plants. You don't want your plant producing and giving all of its energy to tomatoes when it's young. If it doesn't develop a large canopy and grow its roots out, it may have problems taking up nutrients later in its life. This is an easy way to get end blossom rot on your tomatoes, because it can't uptake calcium at the same rate that the tomatoes are growing. Now, there are several other rules that can help, depending on your tomato spacing and whatnot. The first of these helpful tips is pruning any leaves that tomatoes will grow onto or rest on. This tip isn't shared very often, but it's super important in zones that harbor tomato worms and fruit-boring insects. If a tomato is sitting directly on a leaf, that gives easy access for boring insects to traverse into the bottom of the tomato, which is the softest part of the tomato, and eat it from the inside out. Additionally, pruning any stems from either the same plant or nearby plants that are touching will help prevent pests from infecting more than one plant. You don't have to prune the entire stem off, but make sure you at least prune the point of contact. As your young plant grows more foliage, it's a good idea to remove any stems up to 10 inches from the soil line. This includes any drooping stems or leaves that are touching either the pot, the ground, or the raised bed. You don't want any ground pests simply walking right onto your plant from floor level. Pruning the bottom stems also increases airflow to the plant, which helps prevent certain diseases like blight and wilt. What's equally important in pruning is what not to prune. Never top cut your tomato plants. Most, if not all tomato plants, have 2 leading main stems that will fork off at a 45-degree angle once they start to meet maturity. Accidentally pruning these on a determinate plant will completely ruin the season of growing for that particular plant. If you do this, I recommend cloning all of its remaining suckers on the main stem that you accidentally pruned, and converting those clones into new plants. My final pruning tip is cleaning up your pruning shears, preferably between plants. You can either use alcohol and wipe the blades down, or you could do something more fun, like light it on fire. You are supposed to enjoy gardening, after all. In the long run, procuring something like a Zippo lighter actually might be cheaper, as Zippo fuel is inexpensive and you'll use significantly less of it compared to alcohol. When removing stems, make sure not to accidentally remove the stems with flower clusters. Those are called suckers, and suckers are the only type of stem that produces tomatoes. How do we identify a sucker? Well, they're actually super easy to identify. At every main stem, you'll see a stem coming out perpendicularly. Between this beautiful little right angle, or what I like to call the armpit of the tomato, you'll see a little stem coming out at a 45-degree angle. That little guy is what produces 100% of your tomatoes. Now, you are going to want to prune your first few suckers for every tomato plant, like mentioned before. However, after you remove the first 2 to 3 suckers, never remove a sucker unless it's diseased. That is, unless you want bigger but less fruit, or you want to clone some additional plants. The number one plague for new tomato growers is called blossom end rot. Blossom end rot is caused by one of 3 things. Your plants are either getting too much water, as in water is being trapped for too long, your plants aren't getting enough water, and thus they can't move calcium to their fruits in time, or you have a calcium deficiency in your soil and your tomatoes simply don't have enough calcium to go around. This predicament can be incredibly hard to solve, but you will need to figure out which of these is causing your issue. For the first trouble, where you have excess water, you simply need to repot the tomatoes into something more airy, like amending the soil with barky topsoils or raised garden bedding. The second and third issues, being not enough calcium, which is extremely rare, or underwatering, can actually be solved together. If there is a lack of calcium in your soil, which, like I said, is extremely rare, you can give your plants water-soluble calcium, which I'll explain in a second. If you're underwatering, you simply have to either water at specific times or water more. Remember, for an adult plant, the smaller the container, the more you have to water. So how do you give calcium to plants? This method for creating water-soluble calcium is extremely easy, and depending on what you have in your kitchen, it might be free. You might have heard of the eggshell trick, where you crush up eggshells and throw them in your soil. This does technically work, but it's not available nutrients. Those eggshells have to be broken down over time by a microbe-rich soil, just like granulated fertilizer does. If you're having a calcium deficiency problem, like fruits not getting enough calcium, thus you have blossom end rot, what you need is a water-soluble calcium that's immediately available for your plant to benefit from. It's time to do a little bit of chemistry in your kitchen. First, get 2 rinsed off eggshells. Next, you want to either grind them into a powder or smash them into small pieces. From this stage, take a full-sized lemon and juice it into a cup with your eggshell powder. Shake or stir it up slightly. Now, simply wait at least 2 hours. When you come back to this concoction, it should have sort of a foamy top. That is the CO2 being released. As the citric acid from your lemons dissolve the calcium carbonate in the eggshells, now simply strain any solids from this mixture. What's left behind is a beautiful, separated, water-soluble calcium. The acid left over is not strong enough at this point to do any damage to your plant roots. Simply apply this calcium directly to your plant's roots and give it a gentle spray with water to make sure none of it sits on the top of your soil. This calcium can also be applied directly to your fruit and leaves with a fine spray bottle. If you want to make large batches of this calcium, simply use more eggs and lemons. It's roughly 2 eggshells per lemon, and you can leave them to dissolve for up to 48 hours. Do not use vinegar for this method. It may be too acidic and burn your plant roots. Let's talk about pests. The major pests on tomatoes will be moth larvae. These will be hornworms, tomato worms, cutworms, cabbage loopers, etc. Basically, you don't want to see any sort of caterpillar on your tomatoes. You'll either want to squash them, remove them by placing them on another plant, or feed them to animals you might have. Other pests you might come across will probably be either aphids, mites, or stink bug varieties. You can spray them off your plants with a hose, or spray them with peroxide from a fine spray bottle. Because I've dabbled a bit into entomology, and I enjoy the practice, I do, however, have a rather unorthodox tip to help keep worms off your tomatoes. Moths, in general, prefer indirect light environments with a slightly higher humidity to lay their eggs. Knowing this fact, I thought to myself, why not try something? So, I planted Yukon Gold potatoes in one of my shady raised gardens. And wouldn't you know, I haven't had a single tomato worm on my tomato plants. They're all busy absolutely destroying these potato leaves, leaving all the plants I actually care about alone. But I still check at least every morning to make sure they're not helping themselves to a full 9-course meal. Well, that's about everything I know about tomatoes thus far. If you've enjoyed my content or found it informative, subscribing will help me make more of it. Until next time.